Good morning, Dr. Jacobs. How are you doing today?
Morning. Doing
So,
quite
can you
well.
tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a professor at the University of Illinois in the department where I graduated. In fact, yeah, I've gone full circle. I got my undergraduate degree at the University of Illinois in psycholinguistics, psychology, and also with a minor in sociology. And when it came time to decide what to do for graduate school, because I always knew I wanted to be a professor, uh, the sociology people said, well, the kind of thing you seem to be wanting to do sounds like psychology. And the psychology people said, this sounds like sociology. So I figured it had to be communication.
Yeah.
And I wound up in the Department of Communication, where I speech communication, it was called at the time, where I worked with Jesse Delia, who was a social psychologist. You may know of him, developed the theory of constructivism.
Can you define what that term means for the listeners?
Yeah, it's basically the idea that the basic process of communication involves perspective taking and adapting to your audience in terms of the complexity and the sophistication of those cognitive processes behind perspective taking. And I worked with him, worked with David Swanson, who turned out to be my dissertation advisor. But mainly, I kept taking courses in psychology and sociology, doing things with Norm Denzin in sociology, symbolic interactionists, as well as the kind of a cognitive science group of people interested in the pragmatics of language. Then I did my dissertation, which was actually in ethnography,
Oh, wow.
a itinerant preacher who came around all over the country, but he showed up at Illinois. And I was interested in him because there was this puzzle. He didn't persuade anyone. No one ever converted, as far as I could tell. And likewise, the students would show up and they never converted him or got him to adapt. And, that would be a sort of odd situation. You would think the fact that from both perspectives that you're failing to make any headway here would be an interpretive problem, but it wasn't. So anyway, I studied that.
Out of
After
curiosity,
I
what
got
did you
out,
find?
what?
What did you find?
Uh, well, in argumentation terms, this was a case of deep disagreement,
Yeah.
or what you might think of as a kind of incommensurability. But it wasn't just because this preacher had a different worldview. It's because each side, the students as well as the preacher, were able to interpret and rationalize the negative responses that they were getting as proof of their own positions.
Interesting.
And that kind of proof led to sort of patterns of interaction where what the preacher did was interpreted as irrational. So the students would respond with things like ridicule and heckling, which was interpreted by the preacher as evidence of their demonic or their immoral stance, and therefore proof that he was in fact getting to them and standing firmly for God. So he did more of it. And so the deep disagreement wasn't just a matter of beliefs, it was a matter of interlocking practices.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that the argument might also perform other functions besides simply just attempting to resolve a disagreement.
Oh, yeah, that's another interesting thing, which is that in this case, for neither side, um, were they undertaking to persuade the other.
Yeah.
They were standing up in a kind of moral combat. And yeah, argument there is not designed to persuade, and certainly it was not designed to resolve disagreement.
That's fascinating. It seems like it's almost designed in both cases to like sort of prove their own identity, right?
Yes,
The
there's a
students.
definite what used to get called in the literature on extreme rhetoric a ego function,
Yeah, there is an ego
paganistic
function.
ritual kind of pattern.
Yeah, that does remind me of ego rhetoric a lot. That's a good point.
Yeah,
They're
I
more
mean,
interested in
you
defining
still have the
themselves.
function of justification. The
Yeah,
arguments were designed to justify, but not to persuade. They were designed to demonstrate, to make your position public, but not necessarily to convert anyone or to change anyone. I mean,
that's super interesting.
from the student's point of view, it's if it, and most of us take the student's point of view, it's pretty obvious when a preacher says things like, when he dies, he's going to return with Jesus Christ riding on white horses, and they will out of the sky, and they will banish the reprobates with a super cosmic ray. When you got somebody like that, you pretty much have to assume you're not going to be making a whole lot of progress. Well, the same thing is true for the preacher.
Yeah.
When the students laugh at his stories of immoral activities on campus, when they act out, he knows they're not going to be converted.
Right.
And what is interesting is that in other argumentative forums, he did make progress.
Huh.
It was the actual argumentative system taken as a kind of whole performance that created this kind of stable conflict.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So
But
I guess this raises the question more broadly. What do you believe the study of argument offers our society?
I don't think about that a whole lot. I know that people in our field of argumentation are concerned with things like increasing the critical thinking of students. I don't see much evidence that that actually happens, other than, if you think about things, you generally improve, or how it will help improve the level of public discourse. I don't see a whole lot of that either. People who talk about that a lot mainly talk about it at conferences that are attended by other people like them. So I'm interested in argument because it's a form of language use that tells me a lot about how these basic processes work. I think of my own studies as having the same sort of function or legitimacy as, hey, how about astronomy? What's that offer society? We know about the Big Bang. That's a cool thing. I think it's worthwhile. And I think more of argument that way. I think of it in terms of what is it that is interesting here.
Yeah. Well, I think the choice of astronomy is really interesting because it also suggests there's like a natural element to it, right? That you chose
Yes.
a science and a natural science. Do you think that argumentation is a natural part of human existence?
Yeah, it is. And it's a fascinating one because there is a kind of natural basis for argumentation. I mean, everybody in the world does it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like one of those cultural universals.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's also cultural and historical sedimentation of argumentation practices. I mean, you've got to develop a pretty complex society to, for example, get the kinds of argumentation that you find in a court of law, or the kind of argumentation that you find when you do an experiment or you use experimental designs to try to come to conclusions about is there an effect here, or what's the cause, and so on. So yeah, it's natural, but it's really built up.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that distinction between natural and built up. So, can you unpack that just a little bit more?
Well, I started, after I got done with my dissertation, it was time to look at natural conversations.
Hmm.
And I looked at natural conversations without at first having much interest in argumentation, but I became drawn to that. And ordinary conversational argument is basic. It doesn't have any clear institutional framework or any obvious training. People just do that. And I call that basic.
Yeah.
When you look at how argument works in ordinary conversational context, you're seeing something which is, about as fundamental as you can find.
Okay.
Even little kids do it.
Right. Mine might be considered the starting point,
Yeah,
right?
it starts off with disagreement, and then they start giving reasons, and then
Yeah.
they start answering those reasons, and it develops until, well, throughout life.
Yeah. So that would be what you describe as natural. So what do you mean when you say built?
Bill, uh, well, the best examples, I think, of contemporary argumentation theory are what you find in a course on experimental design,
Hmm.
particularly when it's like for uh, a social science, or a course in survey research methods,
Hmm.
or a course on tests and measurement. I mean, you want to know about sign reasoning?
Hmm.
Go take a course in tests and measurement. If you
Yeah.
want to know about generalization, go take a course in survey design and sampling theory. If you want to know about causal argument, go look at experimental designs. Those are all built.
Yeah. Well, do you think we could even think of a more basic example like the legal system? It seems to be an example of a built argument.
Yes. Yeah, and it has all sorts of procedural requirements and rules that are all designed to improve the argument in one way or another.
Rules for when you can submit evidence, rules when you can make an objection.
Right.
So these also could be called contexts, right? Like if you're going to another built environment might be a medical treatment center,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Or uh, one area that I've studied a lot is third-party dispute mediation.
Yeah.
It's a more recent development, at least in America, the last 50 years or so, maybe 60, that it's actually come into widespread practice, but its procedures and its design is oddly all designed to get people to really minimize their arguments, or at least to channelize them in constructive ways.
Yeah, interesting. Regulating disagreements and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what would you call your approach to argumentation?
Well, normative pragmatics, that's the term that I've been using lately.
Can you define those?
Well, I'm interested in two things about argument, and it's different from a lot of the kind of standard argumentation theory. I'm interested in how we express arguments, what it is that allows us to imply an argument, or to allude to an argument, or to make an argument without actually being committed to the argument that I'm making. I'm interested in those communication processes, particularly as they relate to things like deception. A lot of what goes bad in argumentation can be reduced to simple deception processes in one way or another. And that kind of interpretive and expressive processing is what is usually studied in the field of pragmatics in language use. The other side of it is the functional design of arguments. Arguments get used for purposes. They get used to persuade, but not always to persuade. Sometimes they get used to provoke disagreements. Sometimes they get used simply to resist persuasion. Anybody who has a little kid knows how those arguments work. And so I'm interested in that kind of function, and also how argument is adjusted to the kinds of activities in which it occurs. That makes it different than traditional argumentation theory, because traditional argumentation theory likes to take arguments out of their functional contexts and treat them as an activity in and of themselves. One of the really early things I found with Sally Jackson when we were looking at conversational argument is never an activity in its own right. It's always a subordinate activity on behalf of some other activity in which a problem occurs. And how that argument works depends upon the kind of problem that you've got and the kind of activity in which the problem occurs.
Right. So one of the things I'm hearing you say is, if I can reformulate and catch us up, is this idea that for you, an argument always has to be located in another activity. Previous approaches to argumentation always subtracted it from the activity and tried to study it as a thing in itself.
Right.
And so if we try to study argumentation as an ordinary thing, we have to locate it in the thing it's being done. And that requires us to look at two parts. One is these expressive parts, and the other is what are we attempting to do with the argument, which is the functional parts.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, to just give you some examples, because the expressive or interpretive side of argument is closely related to the functional side, because part of what you're interpreting is what's the function here.
Well, before you give an example, can you just, before you give an example, one more important question, and then we'll progress. How do you define an argument?
It's a complex thing.
So then we can have the conversation together.
Something to be called an argument, you have to have reasons.
Okay.
And you have to have some claim, or it's sometimes called a conclusion or a standpoint that the reasons prove. I buy the basic propositional content idea of argument. You've got premises and a conclusion with an inferential connection. That's always there. If you can't find that, if you can't identify what it is, you don't have an argument. You got something else. I mean, you may have a proof, you may have a demonstration. There are lots of ways to demonstrate things without an argument, but you don't have an argument. But above and beyond that, you also have functional features. Argument always occurs with respect to disagreement. Think of what's the difference between an argument and an explanation. Anything that's any propositional structure that can serve as an argument can also serve as an explanation. Although not everything that serves as an explanation can serve as an argument. But it's a different problem that explanations are oriented to. Arguments are always oriented towards managing disagreement. I don't think that you can identify a basic function other than justification, which you're going to see running through all arguments. Depending upon the context and the activity, it's going to have different sorts of functions. There's similarities in some cases, in some acts, dissimilarities in others. But it's the disagreement management and that basic premise conclusion with an inferential form that I think is the core of what an argument is.
Okay. And so you were going to move to these sort of examples that show what you mean by function and expression. I just wanted to make sure we had some definitional clarity before we moved on.
Think of why Donald Trump has been flipping out the media for years now. It's in part because he's performing a function of argument that we haven't seen before. He does two things that his base really likes. One thing he does is he trolls people. He says stuff just to get a rise out of them, to get outrage. It's not to persuade anybody.
Right.
It's in fact to make people mad. And the other thing which is related to that is he bullshits. Now, I mean bullshit in the technical sense of Frankfurter. Second.
Yes, there is a technical sense of bullshit. You heard it right.
Yes.
An academic.
Harry Frankfurter. His book on bullshit. This is a serious academic piece of work, and I can prove it to you because it's published by Princeton University Press. So, Trump is a master bullshitter, and the definition of bullshit isn't that you lie or that you say necessarily anything false. It's rather you speak with disregard for the requirements of truth. You don't care whether it's true or not. And you may say things that are true, but it's still bullshitting because you're not concerned with whether or not what you're saying is justified. He does that all the time.
Yeah. So how would this relate to the expressive and functional properties?
Part of the thing about trolling is it's hard to tell when somebody's doing it. It's like irony on the internet. People can't tell irony or sarcasm on the internet because they don't get the cues. You have to have an insider view to see that's what you're doing. And with bullshitting, you can express a position in multiple levels at the same time. Right now, we're going through the news cycle of, did Trump actually
Is it the bounties?
tell people to reduce the amount of testing, I believe it was. And everybody said, when he said that at the Tulsa rally, that he was joking when he said that. And then Trump later on said, I never joke. Well, which is the joke? Maybe both are jokes. You know, he's just got people going. It's trolling. And that's part of what bullshit allows you to do. You know, doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's interesting. So for me, this raises the next question then is, how do you identify when an argument has occurred?
Well, that's a little complicated because arguments can occur in different ways.
Yeah.
If you want to take the straightforward case of how do you identify when someone's making an argument, that's simply, do I hear reasons? If people don't give reasons, they're not making arguments. You know, the minimal unit of expression for an argument is you have to have at least one clearly and identifiable reason. You know, it's got to be signaled in a way. Stating a claim isn't an argument, you know, because it's an asymmetric process. I can figure out what your conclusion or your claim is from your reasons, but to state the claim, I'm not making an argument because that doesn't feed back into what your reasons must be. You can also tell from context.
Yeah.
That helps. It depends on what you're trying to distinguish an argument from. I mean, are you interested, you know, the real interest is not, is there an argument, but what is the argument? And that's a much harder interpretive thing to identify. It depends on the details of the particulars, because so much of it may be implied.
Yeah, it seems like often human language is so complicated that there's so much unspoken in any interaction that relies on context and cues, and that the reason might be implied. How do you go about making sense of that?
Well, I developed some principles that at least I can point to, but I mean, there isn't any mechanical way to identify what the content of an argument is. Anybody who says that their methods or that their approach will tell you how to do that, no, it's not going to do it. There is no mechanical procedure available for that. You just have to be trained and practiced in how to decide what could be meant by what is said and from what is said. There are things, though, that, you know, if you're careful, you can at least tease it out and articulate it. Take, for example, Black Lives Matter. Right? When you get the response, all lives matter, that's attributing a particular reading to Black Lives Matter. And it's a reading which is I think most people would agree, rather uncharitable. When I say Black Lives Matter, I don't mean only Black Lives Matter. What I mean is Black Lives Matter too. And when you say all lives matter, that's not a response to or it's not a good response to Black Lives Matter, because that that claim, all lives or Black Lives Matter too, presupposes all lives matter.
Right.
It's not an issue.
I love that example of reconstruction, right? Because that demonstrates two modes of reconstruction that you can engage in simply by placing one word in two different places, or two different words in two different places. You can radically alter the meaning of a really popular, two different arguments, right? So to speak.
Yeah, and what you have to do is ask which interpretation makes sense.
Yeah.
What's your evidence that this group who's saying Black Lives Matter means only Black Lives Matter, when it's pretty obvious that it's up against the context of everybody assumes white lives matter.
Right. Right. And that's where it comes into being where there's a degree of like looking at the context, and reconstruction is an art, right? It's not
Yes.
it's not a
Yeah,
science.
you have to identify what the context is and what the context is that people either do take into account or should take into account.
Yeah. I think it's a really, really good example. So we sort of got to the next question about how do you analyze arguments. I want to know, how do you determine then what is a good argument? Like, how do you evaluate the quality of argumentation?
Well, the sort of standard answer to that is the kind that you're going to get from, say, informal logic. I'm not interested in that at all. I don't think that those accounts have brought us very far. I think that if you want to know whether or not a good argument by generalization is any good, you ought to simply go read up on sampling and statistical analysis. If you want to know whether or not a sign argument is any good, you ought to go look at the methods that get used in the particular subject matter where you've got that sign. What I do look at, though, is something more like, do these moves help to make constructive or obstructive contributions to a discourse? That is something that I'm interested in. I had talked, I think, a little earlier about third-party dispute mediation. Turns out that there are certain kinds of arguments you can't make in third-party dispute mediation not because they're in principle bad arguments, but because the other disputant in the mediation isn't going to accept them, and you know that. And so, go find a different argument. Or I suppose anything that I think is deceptive is typically a bad argument. I'm a big believer in appeals to truth and justifiability on the basis of the evidence.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it seems like a lot of your definitions of argument quality are very much tied to the arguers themselves.
Well, or to the context.
In the context that they're.
I don't agree with a kind of common rhetorical account of a good argument. A good argument is a persuasive one. That virtually all of the standards that you find coming from the rhetorical tradition reduce down to that in one way or another.
Right.
I mean, they may be one or two steps removed from it, but it's always that. And hey, just because people accept a position doesn't mean that they're right.
Right.
And just because people reject it doesn't mean that they should have.
Right. Well, then you lose a standard of reasonableness, right? And that's one of the questions that argument is interested in.
Yeah, people, people themselves understand that their own judgments cannot be the ultimate arbiter. because they themselves know that they can be wrong, that
Yeah.
they can make mistakes.
Yeah. So I guess this brings me to a question. Can you give me a really good case study you're working on right now that illuminates your perspective of argumentation?
Well, right now I'm working on a couple of things. I've been developing a paper on, of all things, the history of academic debate and how the development of that activity illuminates basic principles of reasoned disputation. They're the sorts of principles everybody knows, an obligation to bear the burden of proof, the obligation to answer objections, matters like that. But in another line, I've been looking at how standpoints emerge in argument rather than being the starting points of argument. And in that regard, I've been analyzing how, with Sally Jackson and some others, I've been analyzing how in a news conference on the Charlottesville killing, Donald Trump's standpoint emerged at the end. It was something that the reporters had to pull out of him. And also at the same time, it's something that I think you can see that Trump was building. He was creating arguments and in answers to questions, and those arguments converged on a particular standpoint.
So real quick for the audience, what is a standpoint? Because I know it means something very
Standpoint
technical.
is something like a claim or a conclusion, but it is typically in argumentation theory seen as something that comes first, that is prior to making arguments. Doesn't look like that's always the case.
And does it
Sometimes,
entail any burdens or obligations if it is once it's offered?
a standpoint?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, you got to defend it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a little complex because, of course, there are conditions under which you can back down from a standpoint or revise a standpoint, and we don't really have good accounts of how that works. But we always seem to presuppose that there's a standpoint from the beginning.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to be the only way that it works in argument.
That's a really cool paper idea. I want to talk to you about that a little bit more after we're done interviewing.
Yeah.
So I guess the last question I have for you is there anything else you think we should know or anything you want to communicate to future argumentation scholars?
Just keep studying, keep looking.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Jacobs. And
Thank you.
we look forward to talking soon.
I enjoyed it.
Cheers.
Cheers.